The silence in the house was suffocating, but it wasn't the kind that brought peace. It was heavy, sharp, like the moment before a storm rips everything apart. Vernon's hands trembled as he forced open the steel door of Anita's hidden safe, a place he had always respected as off-limits. Inside, buried under neatly stacked folders and a velvet jewelry box, was the single piece of paper that shattered everything he thought he knew. The DNA test stared back at him like a loaded gun. Nicole wasn't his daughter. The name of the real father, a man Anita had buried in lies for decades, was printed in black and white. In that split second, Vernon felt the ground beneath him fracture, as if the entire foundation of his life had been built on quicksand. This wasn't betrayal. This was annihilation. Vernon's hands trembled as the paper brushed against his skin, its surface smooth, almost weightless, and yet it carried the weight of everything he thought he knew. The thin envelope had been buried beneath layers of meaningless documents inside the safe, wrapped in the quiet arrogance of secrets that were never meant to be found. The moment the envelope was slit open, something inside him shifted, a silent, brutal fracture. Black letters. Cold numbers. A name he loved more than his own. Nicole. And beside it, a brutal, clinical verdict that dismantled decades in a single breath: not his child. Not his blood. Not his truth. The floor beneath his feet seemed to tilt, though the room was perfectly still. Vernon's pulse pounded behind his eyes like a war drum, each beat pulling the edges of the world further apart. The air was heavy, thick with something sour and metallic, as if betrayal itself had a taste. The walls that once held warmth, laughter, trust, and years of shared silence now stood as witnesses to an execution, the execution of everything he believed was unshakable. For 20 years, Vernon had built his identity around the image of a man who had done everything right. A loyal husband. A protective father. A steady anchor. He had given his soul to the idea of family. Every sacrifice he made, every compromise, every wound he endured, had been in the name of that belief. But the truth now sat in his hands, clinical, final, indifferent, and with it, his entire world began to rot from the inside out. Anita's footsteps approached from down the hall, too soft to belong to someone ready to face destruction. The sound bled into the heavy air, growing closer with every second. She stepped through the doorway and froze. The sight of Vernon, standing rigid with the paper in his hand, stripped the color from her face. Her breath caught in her throat, and something primal flickered in her eyes, the naked terror of a liar who has finally run out of places to hide. For years, she had carried this secret inside her like a venomous thing. She had convinced herself that silence was protection, that what is buried deep enough can never crawl its way back to the surface. But truth is not a corpse, it does not decay. It festers. It waits. It watches. And when it rises, it does so with a hunger that devours everything in its path. Vernon did not move. His stillness was not calm, it was the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks beyond repair. His eyes burned, not with tears, but with something far colder. The kind of cold that scorches. It was not a man standing before Anita. It was the aftermath of something dying inside him, something that would never return. Every memory began to unravel. The late nights holding Nicole as a baby, whispering promises into the darkness. The school plays, the scraped knees, the proud moments when he saw his reflection in her laughter. Now every single memory was tainted, rewritten with a brutal aftertaste. They no longer belonged to him. He had loved a lie. Raised a lie. Built a life on a foundation that was never his. Anita's knuckles dug into the doorframe, desperate for something solid. A cold wave spread through her veins as reality closed its grip around her. There was no way to run, no lie sharp enough to cut through what he now held. She could feel the structure of her carefully constructed world crumbling in slow motion, every brick falling back onto her chest. Vernon's heartbeat turned into a roar in his ears. He could feel the rage crawling through him like something alive, something poisonous. It wasn't a flash of anger, it was an ocean, slow and merciless. He imagined every possibility at once, burning the house to the ground, erasing everything that had ever carried her scent, tearing their shared life into pieces so small they could never be put back together again. A part of him wanted her to scream. A part of him wanted her to suffer. But mostly, a darker part, the one he didn't want to acknowledge, just wanted everything to stop existing. Outside, the evening pressed against the windows. The house was silent, yet it vibrated with a pulse, a malignant, suffocating presence that belonged not to the wind but to the truth itself. A home once filled with warmth now reeked of betrayal, of something rotten blooming in the air. Nicole was out there somewhere, living under the illusion of safety. The thought slashed at Vernon with surgical precision. She would never be able to return to that innocence again. When she learned the truth, it would rip her open, just as it had ripped him. This wasn't just a betrayal between husband and wife. It was a detonation. And Anita had lit the fuse decades ago. Anita wanted to move closer, to speak, to plead, but there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like poison. Her secrets had lived inside her for so long they'd become part of her bloodstream. She had thought time would make it easier, that if she buried the past deeply enough, it would dissolve. But lies are not soil, they are stones. They remain, heavy and cold, waiting to crush. The distance between them was not measured in steps. It was measured in broken years, in everything they had shared that was suddenly unrecognizable. Vernon's face, once familiar, now twisted in ways Anita had never seen. There was something monstrous about the way silence wrapped around him, a quiet that was far more terrifying than rage. Inside Vernon, a storm raged without sound. One part of him wanted to destroy her, to rip away the mask she'd worn and show the world what she'd done. Another part, deeper, older, more exhausted, simply wanted to disappear into the dark and never feel anything again. But the truth didn't offer him an escape. It chained him to this moment, to her, to the unbearable reality that every sacrifice he'd ever made had been for a lie. He stared at the paper again. The letters blurred, not because of tears, but because the world itself seemed to recoil. His body felt foreign, as if anger had hollowed him out and left something else in its place. Something dangerous. Something final. Anita could feel his rage without him speaking. It filled the room, thick and heavy, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. For the first time, she understood there would be no forgiveness. Not now. Not ever. What she had done was not a wound, it was an erasure. She had not simply betrayed him. She had rewritten his entire existence. And then came the silence. It stretched between them like a blade, sharp enough to bleed without ever cutting skin. Every second passed like a drop of acid, dissolving whatever fragile threads had held them together. The house seemed to shrink around them, the air thinning, as if the walls themselves could no longer bear witness to what they had become. Vernon imagined Nicole's face when she would learn the truth, her confusion, her devastation, the way her world would cave in just as his had. He imagined Anita's past, the man who had been hidden from him, the choices that had built this quiet betrayal brick by brick. This was not a single moment of weakness. This was decades of carefully constructed deceit. And he had been the fool who built a life on it. He thought of the nights he defended Anita against his family, against the whispers that she was hiding something. He remembered her tears, her trembling hands, the way she'd clung to him. All of it, every performance, every lie, now gleamed with a sickening clarity. She hadn't just lied. She had crafted a life out of it. Something inside Vernon cracked then, a small, invisible fracture that spread like black ink through water. There was no going back. He would never be able to look at her the same way again. He would never be able to look at Nicole without feeling the burn of that paper seared into his mind. The clock on the wall ticked, indifferent. Time was still moving forward, dragging them with it, even though their world had stopped. The night outside thickened, pressing its darkness into the house. Vernon's grip tightened around the paper until his knuckles blanched, until it crumpled, until the sound of it breaking mirrored the sound of something much larger inside him tearing apart. Anita's knees weakened. The guilt she had lived with for years finally took shape, no longer abstract, no longer buried. It stood between them now, fully formed and merciless. She saw the hatred in his eyes, but worse than that, she saw the absence, the part of him that had already detached, that no longer belonged to her, that no longer belonged to anyone. She had built her life on a secret. Now she would have to watch it collapse in real time. Vernon's rage was not explosive. It was quiet, steady, the kind that didn't burn out, the kind that destroys everything slowly, methodically. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a black ocean, watching the waves swallow everything he had ever loved. And the most brutal part of it all was knowing, she had put him here. The air in the house felt different now. Colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of every unspoken lie. Vernon stood motionless in the doorway of what used to be their shared bedroom, but the room no longer belonged to them. It felt like a mausoleum of a love that had died long before he opened that safe. The light from the hallway fell over the floor, illuminating scattered pieces of the shattered frame that once held their wedding photo. The smiling faces inside it now looked like ghosts mocking him, trapped forever in a lie they both helped build. She threw her silence, and he threw his blind faith. The DNA result lay on the dresser, fluttering slightly from the draft coming through the half-open window. That single page had stripped Vernon of his identity as a father, a husband, even as a man who once believed in trust. Every word he had ever spoken to Nicole now burned inside his mind, every bedtime story, every birthday candle, every "I love you." None of it had been real in the way he believed it was. And yet, it was his love that had built her world. That truth was his only anchor in a storm that had already consumed everything else. Anita sat in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her breath shallow, as if even breathing had become a crime. Her eyes were swollen from tears, but Vernon saw no innocence there, only the reflection of decades of deception. She had chosen this path long ago, and now the consequences had finally come for her. For them. For Nicole. It wasn't just the lie itself that burned him. It was the fact that she had looked him in the eye every single day, watched him hold Nicole, raise her, protect her, love her, and said nothing. He wanted to scream. He wanted to destroy everything. But something far more dangerous had settled inside him, a cold, calculated silence. That silence grew like a shadow behind his ribs, filling every hollow space where love used to live. It was no longer about forgiveness. This was about survival. About reclaiming whatever remained of the man who had been buried beneath someone else's story. Downstairs, the clock ticked with cruel precision. It marked the slow death of what they once were. Vernon knew that nothing would ever be the same, not tomorrow, not a year from now, not ever. Nicole, innocent in all this, was sleeping somewhere under the same roof, unaware that the world she trusted was about to collapse. The cruelest part of it all was that he still loved her as his daughter, but the truth had poisoned that love, turning it into something jagged and unrecognizable. Anita whispered his name, a fragile sound that barely reached him. But Vernon didn't move. He didn't need to. She knew that the version of him who had once belonged to her no longer existed. In his place stood a man stripped down to raw, brutal truth, a man with nothing left to lose. He turned his back to her, not out of hatred, but because there was nothing left to face. The past had been burned to ash. The future would be built on something colder, sharper. The house creaked softly as if it, too, was mourning the death of their family. But Vernon didn't mourn. He simply walked away, leaving Anita alone with the wreckage of her own making. Outside, the night air bit into his skin, and for the first time, the darkness didn't feel empty, it felt honest.